Okay, and we are back with Chapter 6. So, Chapter 6, we are now meeting Dr. Manette. So, Mr. Defarge has taken Mr. Lorry and Lucy up to meet him for the very first time. And so, look on page 30. So, as I mentioned in the last video, I always recommend when you see a description of someone that you write that. So, in the middle of page 30, I have it written here. You get the description of Dr. Manette. So it tells us what he looks like. Basically, everything is worn and tattered, and he looks completely disheveled. Next thing I want you to note is on page 31. And so essentially what's going on here is they're trying to get him to remember who he is and what's going on. And so he's asking, Mr. Defarge is asking, Yes, Mr. Defarge is basically asking Dr. Manette to tell Mr. Lorry what kind of shoe he's making. So again, Dr. Manette, for whatever reason, is really enthralled by his shoemaking. So he's making these shoes, he's sitting on his workbench making these shoes, and so Mr. Defarge is basically trying to draw his attention away, and he says, "What is the maker's name?" So this is in the middle of page 31. And it says, "The task of recalling him from the vacancy into which he always sank when he had spoken was like recalling some very weak person from a swoon, or endeavoring, in the hope of some disclosure, to stay the spirit of a fast-dying man." Dickens is cluing us in here. So if you remember, the message that Mr. Lorry gave to Jerry Cruncher when he was told that he needed to meet Mamselle, which ended up being Lucy Manette, he told him recalled to life. And so this message, recalled to life, so Dickens is using that word again, recalled. He uses it twice in one sentence on page 31. He says, "The task of recalling him from vacancy into which he always sank when he had spoken was like recalling some very weak person from a swoon." So to recall, right? So bring him back from. So recalled to life, and then recalling him from the vacancy into which he always sank. So they're trying to get Dr. Manette out of this weird state where he's making these shoes. They're trying to recall him out of that. They're like, "Hey, tell us about the shoe," right? What is it? It's almost like you would do with a child. And so he says, "What is the maker's name?" Mr. Defarge asks. And then after a moment, Dr. Manette kind of looks up and he says, "Did you ask me for my name?" And he says, "Yes, I did." His response is unusual, right? He doesn't give us a name, he gives us an address. He says 105 North Tower. Mr. Defarge says, "Is that all?" He simply repeats 105 North Tower. So this is weird and significant. So this is on page 31. This is where Dr. Manette supposedly is telling us his name, and he gives us an address. So I would certainly write this down. Let's see. Yes, I would certainly write this down. It's where he's telling us his name, and he says it's an address. He says 105 North Tower. Write that down. That's very significant. Next, let's go to page 32. So again, Mr. Lorry and Mr. Defarge are trying to revive Dr. Manette. And so this is towards the top of page 32, and Mr. Lorry basically lays his hand upon Defarge's arm, and he's pointing to the two of them, right? He's talking to Dr. Manette, and he's pointing to himself and Mr. Defarge, and he says, "Do you remember nothing of this man? Look at him, look at me. Is there no old banker, no old business, no old servant, no old time rising in your mind, Monsieur Manette?" And so he's basically like, "Don't you remember either of us? You know who we are. Do you not remember either of us?" They're trying to get him to remember. He's been gone for so long, they're trying to get him to remember. Oh man, I got another loud bird. All right, well, we'll just stick with it. Hopefully it's not too annoying, sorry. Okay, so then moving to page 33. So this is the first time that he even notices Lucy, that Dr. Manette notices his daughter Lucy. Lucy the entire time has been hidden in the shadows because it's really dark up where he's working. So this is the first time he actually sees her. And so while she is there, he pulls out this locket. He immediately sees her, and on the middle of page 33, it says, "Her golden hair, which she wore in long curls, had been hurriedly pushed aside and fell down over her neck. Advancing his hand by little and little, he took it up and looked at it. In the midst of the action, he went astray, and with another deep sigh, fell to work at his shoemaking." But then it says not for long, right? Because then, again, she basically places her hand on him, and he pulls something out from underneath his shirt. It says, He put his hand to his neck and took off a blackened string with a scrap of folded rag attached to it. He opened this carefully on his knee, and it contained a very little quantity of hair, not more than 1 or 2 long golden hairs, which he had in some old day wound off upon his finger. And so basically what he does is he takes out this locket of golden hair. And so he takes out this locket and he looks at Lucy's hair in his hand, and he looks closely at it. And he says, "It is the same. How can it be? When was it? How was it?" So there's something about Lucy's hair that is finally striking his memory. There's something about her that he is seeming to remember, and it's something to do with this golden hair and this hair that's in the locket that seems to be the same, right? But then if you turn to page 34, it becomes clear what he thinks, or perhaps who he thinks Lucy actually is. And so he's looking at her and he's saying, "How is this possible? How is this possible?" And then towards the middle of the top of page 34, he says, "No, no, no, you are too young, too blooming, it can't be." And so he says, "See what the prisoner is." He's talking to himself. He says, "These are not the hands she knew. This is not the face she knew. This is not a voice she ever heard. No, no, she was, and he was, before the slow years of the North Tower ages ago. What is your name, my gentle angel?" And so essentially what's happening here, so before Dr. Manette was imprisoned, he knew some female, right? And so he thinks Lucy is his wife. That's who he thinks she actually is. And so when he says, "No, no, you're too young, this can't be," he's like, "Wait a second, you've got the same hair, but this isn't the same voice. This is different," and he can't put it together, right? And so Lucy, because he's in such a foreign state, she is simply just trying to calm him down. And so that's what she's saying on page 34 into page 35. She says, at the bottom of 34, she says, "If when I tell you, dearest dear, that your agony is over, and that I have come here to take you from it, and that we go to England to be at peace and rest, I cause you to think of your useful life laid waste, and of our native France so wicked to you. Weep for it, weep for it." And so essentially what she's doing here, she's comforting him, and she's saying, "Look, I've come here, I am coming to recall you to life," right? And she says that we're going to go to England to be at peace and at rest. And so he essentially is being held now by Lucy. He's overcome by his emotions, by his somewhat memory that he has. He can't figure it out. And again, he's been in prison for so many years that he's having a hard time coming to terms with reality. So she's just trying to soothe him. And so that's the plan. They're going to leave Paris and go to London so she can take care of him. And so on page 35, Mr. Lorry says, "Well, wait a second. Is he fit for the journey? Like, do you really think he's okay to travel all the way to London?" And she responds, she says, "More fit for that, I think, than to remain in this city so dreadful to him." And so she's like, "Look, we've got to get him out of here, right? It is clearly better that he leaves here than stays where he's clearly, he's not a real person. He's some shell of a man where he is right now." And so then let's go ahead and turn to page 37. So they get all the papers ready. They've got to get papers to travel. They're going to leave Paris and they're going to go to England. And so while they're doing this, they're getting in the coach. And on page 37, you've got this repetition of a phrase that I mentioned I wanted you to associate with Madame Defarge. So twice on page 37, we get this repetition of the phrase "saw nothing." So if you look at the top of page 37, they're getting ready to leave. And it says, "Only one soul was to be seen, and that was Madame Defarge, who leaned against the doorpost, knitting, and saw nothing." So even though she's there, right, she's seeing them all leave. She sees what they're doing. They're getting in the coach. She sees Dr. Manette, Lucy, and Mr. Lorry all getting ready to travel back to England. She, quote-unquote, saw nothing. And so, again, when she realizes that Dr. Manette wants his workbench, he wants his tools for making his shoes before they leave, she says she'll go get them. And so then, still towards the top of 37, it says, "She quickly brought them down and handed them in, and immediately afterwards leaned against the doorpost, knitting, and quote-unquote saw nothing." Okay, so again, she has now quite certainly seen them. She's gone to get his tools, she's brought them down to him, and yet she quote-unquote saw nothing. So keep that in mind. We're going to get this repetition of Madame Defarge and this saw nothing. What does Charles Dickens mean by that? We've yet to find out, but go ahead and make note of that. There's the repetition that she is seeing nothing. Lastly, the last thing I want to point out to you from chapter 6, at the very bottom. So this is the last few sentences. They are now leaving. They're in the coach. And it says, all through the cold and restless interval until dawn, they once more whispered in the ears of Mr. Jarvis Lorry, sitting opposite the buried man who had been dug out. So first of all, I'm going to pause there. I'm not even going to finish the sentence. So Mr. Lorry is sitting in the coach opposite Lucy and her father, Dr. Manette. And we get, again, the repetition of digging. Why digging? It says Mr. Lorry was sitting opposite the buried man. So even though he's alive, even though Dr. Manette is alive and he's been alive for the past 18 years, he's just been in prison, it says he's sitting opposite the buried man who had been dug out. And so it says Mr. Lorry, wondering what subtle powers were forever lost to him and what were capable of restoration, the old inquiry. I hope you care to be recalled to life, and the old answer, I can't say. So if you remember from earlier in book 1, in book the first, when Mr. Lorry is riding in the Dover mail coach, he has these visions. He's haunted by these weird dreams where he's talking to someone and he says, I hope you care to be recalled to life. And he gets these mixed responses every time throughout those dream-like visions. And so again, he's sitting in the coach. This time, he is with Dr. Manette. And he still is having this question, right? It says he's haunted by this question. So he's looking at him. He doesn't actually ask Dr. Manette this, but he's thinking. He says, I hope you care to be recalled to life. Again, the repetition of the word recalled. And then the old answer, I can't say. So the repetition there of digging, recalled to life, and these dreamlike visions that have sort of haunted Mr. Lorry, perhaps now they seem to apply to Dr. Manette. So was he thinking about Dr. Manette, this man for whom he worked years and years ago at the bank? Is he now being recalled to life? We've yet to find out. So that is the end of my analysis for Chapter 6. Hopefully these videos help you prepare for the quiz. Again, your quiz is going to be Wednesday, April 15th. It's going to be on FlexiQuiz. It will be timed. So please, again, you shouldn't be using your books. This is to demonstrate your knowledge of what you've been reading, as well as your understanding of my analysis that I've elaborated in these videos. So if you have any questions before the quiz, feel free to email me. I will post a video on Wednesday walking you through the quiz, what else you need to do Wednesday after you take the quiz. These videos were purely just to help your analysis of those chapters since a lot happened. And again, I know reading Dickens can be confusing. So hopefully that was to your benefit. Again, email me if you have questions, and you guys will get another video shortly.